As Flight 236 cruised at 39,000 feet, everything appeared routine. The Airbus A330 was a state-of-the-art aircraft, known for its efficiency and reliability. On board were 293 passengers and 13 crew members, all expecting a smooth transatlantic journey. Captain Robert Piché, a seasoned pilot with decades of experience, was in command, assisted by First Officer Dirk de Jager. Both were highly trained professionals, confident in their ability to handle any situation. The aircraft had departed from Toronto Pearson International Airport and was scheduled to land in Lisbon, Portugal. The flight plan took it over the vast expanse of the Atlantic, a stretch of open water where alternate airports were few and far between. In the cockpit, the pilots monitored their instruments, communicating with air traffic controllers and making routine adjustments. Everything seemed perfectly normal until the first sign of trouble appeared. Roughly 4 hours into the flight, a minor anomaly caught the crew's attention. The aircraft's fuel readings showed an imbalance between the left and right tanks. Initially, it seemed like a small discrepancy, possibly a sensor error. It wasn't uncommon for minor fuel imbalances to occur, and the pilots followed standard procedures, transferring fuel between tanks to correct it. However, the numbers continued to shift in an unusual way, raising concerns. Unbeknownst to the crew, a fuel leak had developed in one of the pipes leading to the right engine. A faulty hydraulic line, weakened over time and improperly maintained, had fractured, allowing thousands of gallons of fuel to escape unnoticed. The leak was slow at first, but as the flight continued, it worsened, depleting the fuel supply far more rapidly than expected. As the pilots attempted to manage the imbalance, the aircraft's advanced monitoring systems detected something unusual. A warning appeared, indicating a potential issue with fuel pressure. Concerned but not yet in full crisis mode, Piché and a Jager double-checked their readings. They suspected a possible sensor malfunction, as fuel loss of this magnitude was almost unheard of in a modern airliner. Still, they remained cautious, running through troubleshooting checklists to identify the source of the problem. Meanwhile, the passengers remained blissfully unaware. Most were sleeping, watching movies, or chatting with seatmates, unaware that their flight was steadily running out of fuel. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, serving drinks and snacks, maintaining the illusion of a normal journey. The mood was relaxed, with no indication of the unfolding crisis in the cockpit. As time passed, the situation became increasingly dire. The right engine's fuel supply was critically low, and the pilots realized they were dealing with something far more serious than a sensor error. Suddenly, at 65 miles off the coast of Portugal, the right engine lost power. A jolt ran through the aircraft as the massive turbofan sputtered and failed. Warning alarms blared in the cockpit, confirming what Piché and a Jager already knew. The engine was dead. Flying on one engine over the Atlantic was not ideal, but it was manageable. Twin-engine aircraft like the Airbus A330 are designed to continue flying safely with a single operational engine. However, there was an even greater concern. The left engine was running on dangerously low fuel as well. If they couldn't find a solution quickly, they would be left with no power at all, turning the aircraft into an unpowered glider with nowhere to land. The pilots now had to make an urgent decision. They needed to reach the nearest airport before the situation worsened. The closest available landing site was Lajes Air Base, a military facility on the Portuguese Azores Islands. It was still more than 100 miles away, but they had no other options. They radioed air traffic control, declaring an emergency and requesting immediate clearance to divert. Controllers at Lajes sprang into action, preparing for what was becoming a life-or-death situation. As Flight 236 turned toward the Azores, the unthinkable happened. The left engine also failed. In a matter of minutes, the aircraft had gone from a fully operational state to complete power loss. The cockpit fell eerily silent except for the sound of rushing wind outside the fuselage. With no engines, the plane lost its primary power source, leaving only emergency battery backups to keep vital instruments running. The aircraft was now in an uncontrolled glide, descending rapidly toward the Atlantic below. At this altitude, they had a limited amount of time before they would be forced to ditch in the ocean. Piché, relying on his extensive flying experience, took manual control. Though commercial pilots are not typically trained for engine-out gliding scenarios over the ocean, his background as a bush pilot had given him valuable skills in handling powerless aircraft. Every movement had to be precise. Too much control input could cause the plane to lose speed and stall. Too little could send them into an uncontrollable descent. Piché worked tirelessly, calculating the optimal glide ratio, attempting to stretch their distance as far as possible. His only hope was reaching Lajes before they ran out of altitude. Back in the cabin, fear began to spread. The loss of engine power was noticeable, and the once calm atmosphere shifted to unease. Flight attendants worked to reassure passengers, instructing them to prepare for an emergency landing. Parents held their children tightly, and many silently prayed. The Airbus A330 continued its glide toward the Azores, inching closer to safety. Yet, they were still far from the runway, and the island's rugged coastline presented additional challenges. The pilots had to maneuver the aircraft precisely, ensuring they didn't fall short or overshoot the airstrip. They were flying on pure instinct and skill, with no second chances. As the minutes ticked by, Lajes Air Base finally came into view. The runway was straight ahead, but they were still descending rapidly. Piché had to execute a near-perfect approach, without engine thrust to adjust speed or altitude. Every foot of distance counted. The entire crew braced for impact, knowing they were seconds away from either salvation or disaster. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary emergency landings in aviation history. The aircraft, now nothing more than an enormous glider, descended steadily toward the vast Atlantic below. Without engine power, there was no thrust to maintain altitude, no means to regain lost speed, and no ability to climb should they fall short of their intended landing site. Every moment counted. Captain Piché, gripping the controls with intense focus, was left with only one option: extending the aircraft's glide as far as possible toward Lajes Air Base, hoping they had enough altitude to make it. The Airbus A330 was not designed to fly without power for long. Yet, in that moment, it became a testament to the capabilities of both human skill and engineering. The loss of both engines meant that many crucial systems had shut down, leaving the aircraft running on only a small emergency power unit called the ram air turbine RAT. This small, wind-driven generator supplied just enough electricity to keep essential instruments, hydraulics, and communications operational, but the plane was still incredibly vulnerable. As Piché and Jager assessed their options, they had to consider multiple factors simultaneously. Their altitude was dropping rapidly, and if they miscalculated, they would end up in the ocean. They had no way to restart the engines. Without fuel, they were nothing more than dead weight. Their only remaining hope was that the distance to Lajes was within their glide range. If they were too far, the outcome would be catastrophic. The aircraft was descending at a rate of approximately 2,000 feet per minute, forcing the pilots to carefully manage every control input. Any unnecessary maneuvering could bleed off their remaining altitude too quickly, reducing their chances of reaching solid ground. Piché had to keep the aircraft as aerodynamically efficient as possible, maintaining a precise glide ratio that would maximize their forward travel before they ran out of height. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers had begun to grasp the severity of the situation. The once normal flight had turned into an emergency, unlike anything they had imagined. Many had noticed the silence. Gone was the steady hum of the engines, replaced by an unsettling quiet punctuated only by the wind roaring past the fuselage. The flight attendants, trained for emergencies, moved swiftly to keep order, instructing passengers to prepare for an emergency landing. Fear spread quickly. Some passengers clutched their armrests, white-knuckled and frozen in place. Others whispered hurried prayers, their voices trembling with uncertainty. Parents held their children close, trying to shield them from the growing tension. Yet, despite the fear in the cabin, there was also an eerie calm, the kind that comes when people are confronted with the unknown. In the cockpit, Piché and Jager remained laser-focused on their descent. The aircraft was now well below 20,000 feet, with Lajes still not in clear view. Every second was crucial. If they misjudged the approach, They would either overshoot the runway or, worse, fall short and crash into the Atlantic. Piché's training and instincts took over as he fine-tuned their glide, making micro-adjustments to their speed and trajectory. At 10,000 feet, the first glimpse of Lajes Air Base finally appeared on the horizon. Relief flickered through the cockpit, but they weren't safe yet. The island's rugged terrain and unpredictable winds posed a new challenge. Landing a powerless aircraft required precision, and without engines, they had no room for error. The controllers at Lajes had already cleared the runway, preparing for what they knew would be an unprecedented landing. Emergency crews stood by, fire trucks and ambulances lined up along the tarmac, bracing for impact. This was a scenario few had ever witnessed, a massive commercial jet attempting a full dead-stick landing with no fuel and no thrust to assist its descent. As the aircraft approached the base, Piché had to make a critical decision: how to ensure they reached the runway without coming in too high or too low. If they were too high, they would have to attempt a sharp descent, risking a dangerous landing. If they were too low, they wouldn't make it at all. With only a few thousand feet remaining, Piché executed a series of carefully controlled turns, using up excess altitude while maintaining just enough speed to reach the runway. The approach had to be perfect. There would be no second chance. Inside the cabin, the tension was unbearable. Passengers braced themselves, gripping seats, clutching hands, holding their breath as the ground rushed toward them. The flight attendants shouted final instructions, urging everyone to assume brace positions. The moment of truth had arrived. The Airbus A330 crossed the runway threshold at an unusually high speed. Without engines, the pilots had no means of reducing velocity through reverse thrust. The only option was to use every bit of available runway and rely on the aircraft's braking systems. As the wheels touched down, the impact was jarring. The plane slammed onto the tarmac, the tires screeching as they struggled to grip the surface. Piché deployed the spoilers and slammed the brakes, knowing they had only seconds to slow the aircraft before running out of runway. The sheer force of the landing caused the brakes to overheat, glowing red-hot under the immense pressure. Smoke filled the air as rubber burned against the asphalt. The aircraft hurtled down the runway, rapidly decelerating but still moving at high speed. Passengers clenched their eyes shut, waiting for the final moment of either safety or disaster. The end of the runway approached fast, but miraculously, just as it seemed they might overshoot, the aircraft finally came to a stop. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as the reality of what had just happened sank in, relief flooded through the cabin. People burst into tears, embraced loved ones, and let out cries of gratitude. They had survived what should have been an impossible landing. The crew quickly initiated evacuation procedures, ensuring that all 306 people on board disembarked safely. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, checking for injuries and assisting passengers off the aircraft. Miraculously, there were no fatalities. As the passengers stood on the tarmac, looking back at the plane that had carried them across the ocean in the most harrowing way possible, they realized just how close they had come to disaster. The skill and composure of the pilots had saved them, turning what could have been a catastrophic mid-ocean crash into one of the most incredible emergency landings in aviation history. The investigation that followed would uncover the critical maintenance errors that led to the fuel leak, prompting significant changes in airline safety procedures. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Against all odds, everyone had survived. As the aircraft came to a complete stop, the overwhelming silence was broken by the sounds of passengers sobbing, gasping for air, and whispering prayers of gratitude. Many sat frozen in disbelief, their minds struggling to process the fact that they had just survived an event that could have easily ended in tragedy. Others clung to their loved ones, trembling from the sheer intensity of what they had just experienced. In the cockpit, Captain Robert Piché and First Officer Dirk de Jager finally allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. Their hands, still gripping the controls tightly, slowly relaxed. Their focus had been locked on the task at hand for so long that they had barely processed the gravity of the situation. The weight of what had just transpired began to settle in, but there was no time for reflection yet. There was still work to be done. The flight attendants sprang into action, ensuring the cabin remained orderly as they prepared for evacuation. Their voices, firm yet reassuring, guided passengers toward the exits. The aircraft had landed safely, but there was still an urgent need to disembark as quickly as possible. Smoke was beginning to rise from the overheated brakes, and while no fire had ignited, there was always a risk of a flare-up. One by one, the emergency slides deployed, unfurling against the backdrop of flashing airport lights. Passengers, some still in shock, hesitated at the exits, unsure of how to proceed. The crew swiftly encouraged them forward, helping them slide down to safety. Many stumbled as they hit the ground, their legs unsteady after enduring one of the most terrifying ordeals of their lives. Emergency responders, who had been standing by in anticipation of a possible crash, rushed to the aircraft, prepared to handle any medical issues. Miraculously, there were no serious injuries. Some passengers had suffered minor scrapes and bruises during the evacuation, but nothing life-threatening. The relief among the rescue teams was palpable. This could have ended so much worse. As the last passengers slid down and moved away from the aircraft, Captain Piché and First Officer Jager were the final ones to exit. They took a final glance at the plane, now resting in eerie silence, before making their way down. The ground beneath their feet felt surreal. After hours of fighting to keep the aircraft in the air, they were finally safe. The passengers were quickly transported to the terminal, where they were given blankets, water, and medical evaluations. Many still struggled to find words to express their emotions. Some sat in stunned silence, staring blankly ahead, while others clutched their phones, desperate to contact loved ones. Tears flowed freely, not just from fear, but from overwhelming relief. As word of the emergency landing spread, the gravity of what had just been accomplished began to sink in. Pilots and aviation experts were in awe of what Captain Piché and First Officer Jager had managed to do. Without power, they had successfully glided a massive Airbus A330 for nearly 75 miles, making one of the longest engine-out descents in commercial aviation history. Their precise calculations, steady composure, and extraordinary skill had turned a near-certain disaster into an incredible survival story. In the days that followed, the investigation into the incident began. Aviation authorities, engineers, and safety specialists examined every detail of the flight, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how such a critical failure had occurred. The findings would later reveal that a fuel leak had gone unnoticed until it was too late. A fractured fuel line, weakened by improper maintenance, had allowed thousands of pounds of fuel to escape, leaving the aircraft powerless over the ocean. The realization was sobering. Had the crew not been as skilled, had they not made the exact decisions they did at the precise moments they did, the outcome could have been catastrophic. The fact that all 306 people on board had survived was nothing short of miraculous. Passengers, now back on solid ground, struggled to process their emotions. Some felt an overwhelming appreciation for life, vowing to never take another moment for granted. Others replayed the events in their minds, unable to shake the fear that had gripped them in those final moments before landing. For many, stepping onto another plane would take time, if not an immense amount of courage. The media quickly caught wind of the event, hailing it as one of the most incredible emergency landings in aviation history. News outlets across the world covered the story, marveling at how a powerless aircraft had been brought safely to the ground against all odds. Captain Piché and First Officer Jager found themselves thrust into the spotlight, celebrated as heroes who had defied impossible circumstances. Despite the praise, the pilots remained humble. They had done what they were trained to do, protect the lives of those on board. But even they understood that this was no ordinary emergency. It was a test of skill, endurance, and an unwavering will to survive. As the days turned into weeks, changes were swiftly implemented across the aviation industry. Airlines and maintenance teams were reminded of the importance of rigorous inspections, ensuring that similar failures could never happen again. Procedures for handling fuel imbalances were revised, and new safety measures were introduced to detect leaks before they became life-threatening. But for those who had been on Flight 236, the experience would never be forgotten. The sound of the engines failing, the eerie silence that followed, the slow, powerless descent toward an uncertain fate, these memories would stay with them forever. Yet, among the fear and chaos, there was also something profound, an unshakable gratitude for the skill of the pilots, the composure of the crew, and the sheer luck that had allowed them all to walk away from what should have been a tragedy. As Captain Piché looked out at the aircraft one last time before departing the base, he knew that this flight would be studied and remembered for years to come. Not just as a story of crisis, but as proof of what human skill, determination, and calm under pressure could accomplish. Air Transat Flight 236 had defied the odds, and those who had been aboard would carry that incredible story with them for the rest of their lives. The aftermath of Flight 230 SIX's emergency landing was a whirlwind of emotions, investigations, and reflections. The passengers, shaken but alive, were taken to a secure area within Lajes Air Base, where they were given medical attention and assistance. Many were still processing what had happened, unable to believe they had just survived what could have been one of the deadliest disasters in aviation history. Calls to loved ones filled the air, with voices cracking from a mix of fear and relief. Some passengers simply sat in stunned silence, staring at the walls, their minds replaying those final moments before the aircraft touched down. Others found comfort in talking to fellow travelers, forming bonds that would last a lifetime. They had all shared an experience that no one else could truly understand, and in that shared survival, a quiet sense of unity formed. Outside, the Airbus A330 remained on the runway, its tires scorched, its brakes burned out from the sheer force of the emergency stop. Investigators, airport personnel, and emergency teams surrounded the aircraft, assessing its condition and gathering evidence. The plane, once a symbol of disaster in the making, now stood as proof of an extraordinary feat of aviation skill. Captain Robert Piché and First Officer Dirk de Jager were exhausted but composed. They had done what seemed impossible, brought down a powerless aircraft safely, with every single person on board surviving. Their training, instincts, and teamwork had been tested in the most extreme conditions imaginable, and they had succeeded against overwhelming odds. As they stepped off the plane for the final time, they were met with a mix of admiration and quiet gratitude from the passengers and crew. Authorities wasted no time launching a full-scale investigation. Aviation safety experts and engineers examined every aspect of the flight, from the moment it took off in Toronto to the last second before it stopped on the Lajes runway. It didn't take long for them to determine the root cause. A fractured fuel line had gone undetected, causing a slow but steady loss of fuel until there was nothing left to power the engines. The realization was unsettling. A preventable maintenance issue had nearly cost hundreds of lives. The industry responded swiftly. New protocols were introduced to prevent similar failures, ensuring that fuel systems were more rigorously inspected and monitored. Airlines around the world studied Flight 230 SIX's emergency descent, using it as a case study to improve pilot training for engine-out scenarios. Lessons were learned, changes were made, and aviation safety took a step forward because of what happened that night over the Atlantic. For the passengers and crew, life moved forward, but the experience never truly faded. Some struggled with the trauma of that harrowing descent, finding it difficult to step onto a plane again. Others embraced life with a renewed sense of purpose, cherishing every moment with loved ones in a way they never had before. Perspective shifted, priorities changed, and for many, survival became a powerful reminder of what truly mattered. Captain Piché and First Officer de Jager found themselves at the center of attention, hailed as heroes not just by those on board, but by aviation professionals worldwide. Pilots respected their skill, their ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, and their precise execution of one of the longest unpowered landings in commercial flight history. But despite the praise, they remained humble, knowing that while their expertise had played a crucial role, they had also been given a rare and fortunate outcome. Time passed, and Flight 236 became more than just an event. It became a story, a lesson, a turning point. Documentaries were made, safety reports were written, and pilots in training studied the case as an example of what could be achieved when knowledge, experience, and quick thinking came together. The Airbus A330, which had carried its passengers through one of the most intense ordeals imaginable, was eventually repaired and returned to service. It flew again, a silent testament to its resilience, carrying new passengers to destinations they would never realize had once been the site of a near disaster. For those who had been on board that night, the sound of silence at 39,000 feet, the slow descent toward an uncertain fate, and the jarring impact of landing would forever remain etched in their memories. But so would the gratitude, the second chance, and the realization that against all odds, they had survived. Flight 236 was no longer just a near catastrophe. It had become a story of resilience, a reminder of how quickly life can change, and proof that even in the most dire circumstances, hope, skill, and courage can defy the worst outcomes. As the years went by, those who had been part of that journey carried the experience with them in different ways. Some never spoke of it, others shared it with those who would listen. But all of them, in some way, knew that August 24th, 2001, would forever be a day that changed their lives. For the aviation world, it was a lesson that echoed far beyond a single flight. It was a testament to the importance of vigilance, preparation, and the remarkable ability of pilots to navigate the impossible. And for the 306 souls aboard that night, it was nothing short of a miracle.